I would also like to start by thanking the organizers. It's really quite an honor to be invited to a conference like this, honoring Alex. I've been working in central banking for 15 years, and I've met for the first time Alex shortly after I joined the Federal Reserve at an NBR conference. I was aware of some of his work earlier, but what impressed me over the years is how often I find myself having to go back to stuff he did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that happened to be exactly at the heart of questions we're investigating 10, 20 years later. Things like his work on central bank independence, central bank transparency, the communications issue that is very much in the debate now. Going back to the late 70s, the permanent temporary shock confusion, this eternal problem facing policymakers on a day-to-day basis. And I have not have the pleasure of being a co-author of Alex, but I have experienced his relentless in discussing my work and grabbing me the night and a couple of nights before a conference and talking to me about details of equations in appendices so he could refine his comments, and I'm very thankful for knowing him and learning so much from him. Well, the other thing I'm thankful to the organizers for is that they put my paper with John after Frank's paper, because Frank and Francesco provided a very nice introduction to part of what we are talking about in this paper. What the purpose of our work here is to put the policies of inflation targeting in the context of imperfect knowledge and bring them in the spirit of some of the work in learning that we've been doing over the past several years. And we try to make the point that it's actually very hard to understand the meaning of inflation targeting in any other context. So let me turn into what we mean by that. Well, as Frank already mentioned about general policy, and we would say that this is especially important for inflation targeting policies, the central tenet of the approach is the anchoring of inflation expectations. And several elements that we identify as crucial characteristics of inflation targeting, we list 4 of them here. The commitment to price stability, the fact that the central bank takes ownership of inflation, setting an explicit quantitative inflation target, being transparent about strategy and tactics, having a policy that is forward-looking, that involves close monitoring of expectations and response to them in some form. All of these elements are important elements of inflation targeting. Indeed, many of these elements are important elements of just plain good policy practice and are common to inflation targeting regimes, as well as in policies of other central banks. The ECB, for example, that is not an inflation targeter, or the Federal Reserve, that is another example of a non-inflation targeting central bank. I'll give you 2 examples from the Fed. At the Federal Reserve, we don't even have a precise quantitative inflation objective. We do have price stability as the objective, but nothing precise about it. And yet you see the elements as Alan Greenspan noted, for example, a few years ago, the vigilance against inflation is not just a cliche. It's exactly how any central bank that pursues reasonable policies meets its objectives. Well, then debate is moving forward, so I want to bring just another quote from Ben Bernanke's confirmation hearings a few weeks ago. The understanding of the benefits of an explicit inflation target are quite common in all cases, as Ben Bernanke said, providing quantitative guidance about the meaning of long-term price stability could have several advantages, one of the important ones being the anchoring of long-term inflation expectations. And that is the centerpiece that we see in any good monetary policy regime. and one that has been emphasized more than anywhere else under inflation targeting. Now, we start with this motivation because then, like Frank was doing earlier, we want to question the usefulness and even relevance of simple rational expectations models for helping us understand these benefits. In simple fixed coefficient rational expectations models, which is what we usually write down, inflation expectations are well anchored, pretty much by default. I mean, very, very, very little needs to be done to achieve this great objective of anchoring inflation expectations. In most models, you just have a reasonable policy that satisfies the Taylor principle, and you're done. There isn't much more than that to talk about. So what we want to do is think about the world in a slightly more complex manner. I want to develop a model that incorporates learning along the lines that Frank was talking about, that recognizes that, well, we really face imperfect understanding of the macroeconomy, both on the economic agents' perspective and on the central bank perspectives in the world. And we should recognize that in both the policy side of the issue and on how agents form expectations. Once we have a model like that, then things that concern central bankers, concern inflation targeting and non-inflation targeting central bankers become important. This phenomena of inflation scares, where for temporary but long-lasting periods of time, expectations seem to be unanchored, can be issues that we can discuss. The issue of perceived inflation persistence and the fact that evolves over time is something that can be discussed in this model. So I want to start with a model like that, and once we do that, then examine the importance of some of the key elements of the inflation targeting framework. We will look specifically at two elements of imperfect knowledge. Starting from the second one here, the boundedly rational expectations, we want to deviate from the simplification of rational expectations, which we will have as a perfect knowledge benchmark, much like Fran did in his paper. We will also endow the agents in our economy with a perpetual least squares learning mechanism. We will also endow a similar mechanism to the central bank to learn about some object that the central bank learns about. Now, we want to motivate this somewhat. Why is it that we do not have a simple linear expectations equilibrium? Well, the reason for that is that things do change around us in the economy, and we are never quite sure what the right model is. It's too complicated for us to introduce uncertainty everywhere in the economy, so we will do it in just one area where it seems to be particularly important, and that is recognize the limited knowledge of medium-run natural rates, what we call equilibrium concepts, the equilibrium exchange rate, the equilibrium real interest rate, the equilibrium rate of output growth, and so forth. And we will at least want to recognize that we have limited knowledge of these things. These concepts, we will explicitly talk about the natural rate of interest and unemployment, are unknown fundamentally beyond just a simple filtering problem that we face in the economy. And this is one of the reasons why agents who are concerned about the structural change should actually worry about formulating expectations in any simple manner and always try to use adaptive techniques. To motivate a little bit the uncertainty associated with natural rates from some earlier work we've done, take the natural rate of interest. We hardly know how to model the concept. The issue of whether monetary policy is already at neutral, is beyond neutral, is under neutral, or so forth, is in the news these days. But we have to recognize that we hardly know these things. Different alternative techniques, and here we have 5 of them, give us very different historical measures for this series. You have sometimes several percentage points of differences between different measures, and this is the context where you say, policy is set in these 25 basis points intervals. Well, this kind of dominates that relevant range in terms of describing things. The natural rate of unemployment is not any different. These are retrospective measures. What I'm showing you here is variation in estimates of what the natural rate was 20 years ago, and we still can't quite figure out because different techniques, different methods of answering the question give us so drastically different answers. Does this matter in real time versus retrospective estimation? Well, for the natural rate of unemployment, we can actually see historically the evolution of these measures. Have this picture from an earlier paper where we have the black line is the actual unemployment rate in the United States. The green line is the recent, well, as of 2 years ago, Congressional Budget Office estimate of the natural rate. The red line shows the Congressional Budget Office's real-time estimates of the natural rate. So it's the same agency learning over time, revising its estimates of the same concept. And what you can see here is this persistent misperceptions on what we can call the policymaker side of what this concept is around which we're trying to stabilize the economy. The other thing you see here is substantial serial correlation in these misperceptions, which is evident quite generally in small samples, even with ideal filtering, as the work that Alex did recently with Francesco have shown to us. Well, they modeled the output gap, but I use Okun's law, and to me that's the same as the unemployment gap in this picture. So that's the motivation on why we should be sensitive to this lack of knowledge of at least this aspect of the economy, to motivate empirically somewhat our sensitivity to how we should model expectations. I have much fewer pictures for that, just one. The reason being that we don't observe expectations very well, unfortunately, so there is much limited work we can do. In the United States, we have a fairly long survey that's consistent over time. This is the Survey of Professional Forecasters. From 1968 on, we have quarterly forecast of inflation. What this picture shows is the 4-quarter inflation year ahead. That's the black line. And it compares that with the red line, the real-time actual inflation that corresponds to those forecasts. What I want you to see here is how much serial correlation you seem to have in the forecast errors associated to this concept. Much more serial correlation than you would expect to obtain if everything was nicely driven with a fixed coefficient rational expectations model where everybody knew what was going on in the economy. So this is another aspect, this is another way of saying we need to somehow in our models allow features that can rationalize, if you want to use that word loosely, what we observe in the data in the context of our models. We need to bring these features into our models in discussing policy problems. That's what we're trying to do. So model elements, we want to acknowledge the presence of these imperfections, acknowledge limited knowledge regarding natural rates. I say acknowledge limited knowledge instead of acknowledge our ignorance, because I don't want to be so totally pessimistic about these things. But the idea is to examine the implications of these issues for policy and understand how they translate to the implementation of inflation targeting as one example. We tried to be as close as possible to the data in doing this exercise, so we have some similarities to what Frank was presenting earlier on, but some differences. So we take some shortcuts in different ways and different areas where Frank was taking before. We have a more complicated model. This is a quarterly model of the U.S. economy. It's in the new Keynesian tradition as well, but we don't insist that you motivate it in that way. We have a hybrid Phillips curve, and we do have an IS curve with the unemployment gap, depending on the expected unemployment gap, lagged gaps, and we will explicitly have an interest rate in our model and examine specifically interest rate policy rules characterizing policy and try to understand how the economy would work in that setup. This is an estimated model. We have details in an earlier paper where we estimated this, published in Brookings in 2002. For monetary policy, we will focus on two alternative policy strategies, both of which would stabilize and anchor inflation expectations wonderfully under rational expectations in a perfect knowledge setup. We do not want to do the optimal control experiment that Frank was doing before, because we are not as certain about the model and all of the details of the economy. This relates a little bit to the question Alex had before. We still believe it's important and useful to try to understand how we should design simple, implementable policy rules that a central bank can use at least as a benchmark for discussion purposes, that are evaluated in a context of a model that introduces all of these complications. And then we want to pay special attention to the robustness characteristics of the rules we develop, so that we can be robust to the various things we don't know about the economy as we go along. So we will concentrate our discussion to these two families. For natural rates, well, we don't know how natural rates evolve in reality. We will model that by having highly persistent autoregressions near unit roots. But in order to capture this idea that we can't be very precise we can't endow the policymaker with too much knowledge about this, we will do this by assuming that the policymaker can't quite be sure what the variance of these innovations are. This is one way to summarize the lack of knowledge of natural rates in a simple manner. And of course, we should be investigating as many of these alternatives as we can. We actually will calibrate zero variances, a low degree of variance, which we call the case S equals 1, a higher degree of variance, the case S equals 2. All of this being motivated from the various alternative estimates from alternative techniques that people have used over time to estimate natural rates in the economy. For private agents' expectations formation, well, as a benchmark, we will start from the rational expectations perfect knowledge case. And as our alternative, which we prefer for robustness purposes, we will also do the constant gains least squares that Frank described before. In our case, because we only examine simple rules, it's not hard for us to endow the agents with exactly the reduced form VAR that would correspond to rational expectations. And one way to think about what we are doing is that we say, well, we know that there is this VAR with a bunch of variables that would correspond to expectations formation under rational expectations. Let's not tell the agents what those parameters are and force them to estimate them. Now, that shouldn't be that much of a deal. That's a fairly small deviation from the rational expectations benchmark. As it turns out, it has some significant implications for policy analysis. I will not go through the details of the perpetual learning algorithm. It's just a recursive least squares implementation that Frank had on the board. We will be doing constant gains least squares with recognizing that there is a range of estimates on the gain. In our benchmark, we have 2%. Frank had 3% before. What we found earlier is that a range of values from 1 to 4%, really, that whole range matches quite well the evolution of the survey expectations that we have in the United States. But we can't really tell very precisely where we are in that range. And perhaps for policy purposes, we shouldn't assume that we can ever know precisely how boundedly rational agents are, and we would want to be robust to various alternatives there as well. When the central bank needs to formulate policy in terms of natural rate estimates, we endow a constant gain technology to the central banker as well for updating the natural rates of interest and unemployment. We actually investigated several alternatives here. This is a univariate, very simple case. John, in separate work of his, has investigated how good alternative algorithms, how well alternative algorithms work, and found that this simple one actually performs quite well, so we felt there was no need to complicate things further for our purposes. So very briefly, I want to walk you through, much like Francesco was doing, this learning stuff is fairly simple, so let's go through an overview of what it means when you put it in a policy setting. So very briefly, what I want to do is show you what introducing these imperfections in the economy does to the economy for a simple policy rule. So suppose that the policy maker follows a simple policy rule like the Taylor rule we have here with Taylor's original coefficients. We will have a forecast-based version of the Taylor rule responding to the forecast of inflation. We will have the lagged, which is the latest unemployment rate. Taylor rule, of course, depends on the policymaker's perceptions of the natural rate of interest and the natural rate of unemployment in setting. And we say, let's simulate the economy with this rule under alternative assumptions about what degree of imperfection do we have in the economy, how exactly our expectations form to find out what happens in the economy. A simulation methodology, you can read the details in the paper. I have too much time to go over it. Let's concentrate on a picture here. Let me see. Okay. I want you to concentrate on this panel. If it's not visible, let me know and I can try to enlarge it. What we have here is the impulse responses of the economy, of both inflation, unemployment, and interest rates in the different panels, to the two shocks in the economy, the inflation shock and the unemployment shock. Now, under rational expectations, an impulse response function is a fixed function. It's always the same. Shock hits, it's a linear economy. You always expect the same response. That would be the black line in our model. In our model, with this policy rule, if you have a shock to inflation, one standard deviation, within 2 years you are back to stability in a nice, smooth way. In order to achieve that outcome, the policymaker will have to open a little bit of the gap with the interest rate rule he's following. That means raise interest rates. That means you're going to have the unemployment rise above the natural rate for a while and so forth. Hit the same economy with the same shock if we introduce a little bit of imperfections by having the natural rates moving around and agents not quite knowing how to form expectations, always re-estimating their reduced form VARs to form expectations. What does that do? Well, depending on the exact initial conditions, how high inflation used to be, what the shocks were recently, the same shock is going to have different implications now. So what we need to do is track the distribution of impulse responses to the same shock. The way we want to summarize the effect of this whole distribution of impulse responses in our economy under learning is by plotting the 70% range of impulse responses. You can see here that sometimes we're going to have impulse responses that are very close to the ones we observe under rational expectations. Sometimes we will have a faster return to price stability. Sometimes we will have a much slower return to our inflation target under learning. And this is what gives us this variation of the behavior of the economy. This is one of the manifestations of what Frank was showing before when he was talking about the evolution evolution of the perceived persistence of inflation in the economy. This is one of the many things that are evolving in the economy that are influencing this process. Note a couple of other things. The red line here is the median impulse response. The median impulse response doesn't really have to be the same as what would be under rational expectations when you introduce the learning complications in the process. In terms of macroeconomic performance under this rule, under rational expectations, we have standard deviations to inflation, the unemployment gap, the interest rate. We have the first order autocorrelation, which would be an indication of the actual degree of persistence in the economy. Take the same economy and add natural rate variation, add learning. Let's concentrate on the case with a 2% gain parameter and S equals 1, a benchmark with a little bit of variation in natural rates and learning in the economy. You see that the standard deviation of everything rises in the economy, and the persistence of everything rises in the economy. And this is another manifestation of what Frank was describing before. The economy's performance deteriorates. The persistence of everything deteriorates on you once you introduce these elements into the model. And of course, we know how policymakers are going to want to respond to this. They will want to bring that persistence down in some way, and that's an element that we will see in the model. Now, one of the more interesting aspects relating to the inflation targeting debate is to try to track how long horizon expectations behave in this economy. Well, we have a VAR that agents keep updating, so we can use that VAR to estimate concepts such as the year ahead interest rate and inflation expectations, or the 10-year ahead interest rate and inflation expectations. We do that exercise here. Concentrate, for example, on this panel, the 10-year horizon inflation expectations. Under rational expectations, you hit the economy with a shock, nothing happens to the 10-year ahead inflation expectations. Everything is well anchored as long as you follow the Taylor principle. With learning, what you see is that the 70% range of outcomes is actually all above what you would have expected to observe under rational expectations in this case. The median response is a few basis points, about 10 basis points in this case, above what you would have expected to see. You see significant variation in even long horizon expectations just because you introduce this tiny degree of noise with this policy rule. The precise behavior of these things will depend importantly on the policy that is in place in the economy. And this is one of the reasons why we have to be sensitive about how alternative policy frameworks and how some of the elements of inflation targeting, rhetoric and communication and practice can help improve these deviations that we see from rational expectations here. All of these things have implications for macroeconomic dynamics. We have this rich layer of nonlinear dynamics in the economy. We have the variation in the formation of expectations. We have all of this persistence. So we need to do something about these things. Once we recognize these things, when we try to design policy or just help inform policymakers of what robust policy would look like, well, we may get quite important differences from the answers we would be obtaining under rational expectations. And this is what we want to examine first. In order to do this, it's actually useful to have some benchmark objective for the central bank. Well, the way John and I are thinking about this is that we aren't quite sure what the right objective function is. For different reasons than the one Francesco pointed out. I would dare any member of any central bank policy board to tell me what their lambda and nu parameters are, for example. I mean, personally, I think it's silly to try to think of policy in those terms. But we would want to design or try to help policymakers by offering policies that would perform reasonably well for a range of these alternative potential preferences. So it's useful to start with a benchmark and then do some sensitivity analysis over that. Let's examine then how alternative parameterizations of the policy rule, of the Taylor-style policy rule, would work in this economy. We want to examine how choices of the responsiveness to inflation, theta pi, to unemployment, theta u, would change the performance of the economy. We can summarize this once we have the loss function by showing the loss, iso-loss contours under the rule. Concentrate on a panel here. Take this one. This is our economy under rational expectations. Our rule has two parameters, theta pi and theta u. As we vary theta pi and theta u, we get different losses for this economy. These are the iso-loss, these are the iso-loss contours. So for this economy, with this rule, under rational expectations, the optimal policy would be something like 0.5 on the response to inflation, -3 on the response to the output gap, to the unemployment gap. This is what a policy experiment under rational expectations would suggest. This is what a researcher doing this at a central bank would go and give to the policymaker and say, here, use this as a benchmark for thinking about policy. What we want to do is how this changes once we introduce imperfections in the model. Just do one comparison with this benchmark case of learning with 2% gain and the lowballing variation of natural rates. See how different the outcomes are. Of course, you have higher losses everywhere. More importantly, look at what appear to be the best policy choice under rational expectations is actually a very bad policy choice once you introduce these complications into the economy. A policymaker that recognizes the potential for these issues would want to be much more responsive to inflation, coefficient is about 1.5, less responsive to the unemployment gap, again about 1.5 here. What is interesting to see in these four panels is that alternative assumptions shift the optimal policy quite a bit. There is a sense in which it's not trivial to come up with a robust policy rule here. The policy rule, the optimal policy rule in this setting depends quite sensitively on the assumptions you have. The autocorrelation of inflation also shifts a lot. We have the increase in persistence that Frank was talking about for any rule. You can see that's what would be the optimal rule. Would have yielded something like 0.8 AR coefficient on inflation and becomes about higher than 0.95 in our benchmark economy. So there are these issues associated with this family of rules. We have the lack of robustness. Inflation expectations can become unanchored from time to time. So we can examine alternative policies that may actually do better. One alternative we examined that based on earlier work where we thought could do better is a family of difference rules in which the policymaker simply changes the interest rate in response to the inflation gap and the changes in unemployment in the economy. This is a rule that does not require estimation of natural rates anywhere in the system, so it avoids the problem of natural rate misperceptions that we know from other work is of first-order importance. Of course, this is also a drawback, because if you knew your natural rates, you would want to take them into account. So it's an empirical issue to find out whether a rule of this nature would be sufficiently robust in our setting. We can again do the same contours. We have two parameters, theta pi and theta delta u in this case. In contrast to the picture I was showing you before, what you can observe here is that for different degrees of imperfections, different ways of formulating expectations in the model, you get pretty much the same patterns in the contours. You do your optimal experiment, you do your optimal policy and design here under rational expectation. Turns out this works pretty well, even if you have imperfect knowledge in the economy. So this is a sense in which this particular family of policy rules seems to be much more robust in the economy. To examine a little bit more the properties of optimized difference rules, we are going to concentrate on one specification. You change the interest rate quarterly by responding 1-to-1 to your expected inflation gap, and quite significantly to changes in the unemployment rate in a stabilizing manner. What does the economy look like that? Let me just show you one picture here. The impulse response of expectations to transitory shocks in inflation What you notice here, this economy, same adaptive learning, different rule. Again, we have variation and deviations from rational expectations in our inflation and interest rate long horizon forecast. But note that even with learning all the complications we have, the long horizon inflation expectations and interest rate expectations here are quite well anchored. Now, this is of interest because we haven't actually assumed yet that the public knows the target, that the policymaker has announced a target in any credible way. Just following a more robust policy can have an important effect of stabilizing and anchoring inflation expectations in an environment of imperfect knowledge, regardless of whether you actually state your inflation target or not. Well, this is a situation where we believe the policymaker relentlessly changes the interest rate in this rule whenever inflation deviates from the target. Well, that's really more important than anything else you want to do in this economy. If you keep doing that and you keep doing that in a systematic manner, you will actually stabilize inflation expectations quite well and have all of the benefits associated with that. Still, we can look at this last important element of the value of an explicit numerical inflation objective and find out how valuable this would be in our economy. Unlike Frank's experiment earlier on, in our VR system, agents estimate all parameters, and we do not endow them with anything, except here we will model an explicit inflation objective by essentially saying that agents have to estimate one fewer parameter every time they update their VAR. There is an implicit constraint on the parameters of the VAR which identifies where inflation converges to in the long run. We will endow agents with that parameter, and we will then assume that agents eliminate that from their estimation of the VR. They take that for granted and go on. They want to find out how much that helps in the economy. Well, how much it helps is going to depend on the policy rule that matters. If I show you the impulse responses, you cannot actually see much of a visible effect in the impulse response functions. You do see a visible effect if you look at the long horizon expectations. So take the Taylor rule we have, for example. This is the inflation 10-year ahead expectation that you observe with an unknown target, the benchmark case. We endow agents with a target, and we see that indeed, with the Taylor rule, inflation expectations, once you endow the agents in the economy with a target, become much better anchored, and that is a benefit. Something that is interesting in our model and could be a little bit surprising in some contexts is that even though inflation long horizon expectations are very well stabilized by providing the public with an inflation target, interest rate long horizon forecasts are not necessarily as well stabilized. We are not telling agents here, start from your long horizon expectations, then add to that some equilibrium notion of the interest rate and some premium in order to do this. We're just obtaining the long horizon interest rate expectations from the VAR, and the interest rate side of the VAR isn't any better anchored with or without an inflation objective in our model. And this is a result that surprised us and want to investigate further. But on inflation, we do have some benefits. Question is, do these things depend on the policy rule? Of course they do. How? Well, I'm going to show you the impulse responses to a difference rule. To the difference rule we had before. Again, the impulse responses in the economy with and without knowledge of a target don't seem to differ that much. This should not be very surprising. Giving agents in the economy a target is only giving them one number. Agents in the economy who are interested in forecasting year-ahead inflation, year-ahead unemployment need much more information than that. So you can have a little bit of an improvement, but just knowing the inflation target isn't really the solution to all problems out there. And this is why the benefits are somewhat small. Note that in this case, we also get a reduction in the variance, compare the 10-year ahead variance of the impulse responses to an inflation shock in the economy with a difference rule Without knowing of the target, we have this variation here. Knowing the target, we are essentially back to rational expectations in terms of anchor inflation expectations. But what you see here is that because with a well-designed difference rule, these long horizon expectations were already very well anchored, yeah, you gain some, but you don't really gain that much in terms of anchor inflation expectations. Better. Now, even though you do not gain in that sense that much, and the impulse responses do not look that different, those small differences do have an effect on stabilization in the economy. So what we do in this panel is we pick two well-designed rules. This is one of the better performing Taylor level rules in our model. This is the benchmark difference we were comparing before. I want you to look at the standard deviations in the economy with an unknown target and with a known target. Look at the case of S equals to 1. Standard deviation of inflation, for example, with an unknown target, Taylor rule drops from 2.6% to 2.4%. And that is a substantial benefit, about, let's say, 10% reduction in the asymptotic standard deviation of inflation. Similarly, with the difference rule, where the differences in the impulse responses are so tiny, again, you do get a reduction. From 2.2% standard deviation, you fall to 2.1%. You have a 5% reduction there. So you do have an improvement in the performance of an economy in our model from announcing an explicit quantitative objective. But more importantly, the biggest improvement seems to be from opting for a framework that seems to be robust to the imperfect knowledge in the first place, and that in our case proves to be the difference rule specification over the Taylor rule specification. So if you are following a bad framework that tries to define policy in terms of deviations from natural rates, announcing your target gives you some improvement, but you are really missing the point. Because you could have designed a more robust framework, and in our view, the practical implementation of inflation targeting is originally proposed, which wasn't about optimal control exercises trying to find exactly how to match the interest rate gap from an unemployment gap and so forth, but just concentrating on stabilizing inflation seems to perform quite well. So the benefits of the target I already talked about. What a summary of our results is that even though words are useful and successful communication of the central bank's inflation objective does help in anchor inflation expectations and stabilizing the economy, actions are really more important than words. If you have a robust framework that anchors inflation expectations as the primary thing you are doing, it's actually of a little bit less importance to be overly precise about what your target is. And it would be important in our perspective to try to be robust to various elements in the economy, imperfect knowledge, and have something that is simple to communicate and implement for policy. Now, what surprised us a little bit after doing all of this stuff is that we went back and read Wicksell, the very last chapter in Wicksell's book from 110 years ago, on natural rates. And what struck us is that after defining the natural rate of interest, which later became the notion for the definition of the natural rate of unemployment, Wicksell, in instructing policymakers how to operate, he said, make sure you don't actually try to estimate and follow this natural rate. You don't need to know what the natural rate of interest is to stabilize the economy. As he says, that would be impracticable and unnecessary. All you need to do is just make sure that you raise interest rates if prices go up, you cut interest rates if prices go down. Essentially, Wicksell was arguing for a simple, robust guide to monetary policy, the robustness coming to several characteristics, importantly, in his case, to the fact that we shouldn't be relying on things we don't know to design good policy. So what we are trying to do in this paper is simply explain the importance of imperfect knowledge in actual monetary policy and design, and relate this somewhat to the reasons why inflation targeting became such a useful way to think about monetary policy, but some of the things that don't show up in the rational expectations, linear quadratic way of modeling the beast. This is about simplicity, ease of communication, concentrating on anchor inflation expectations. We need to deviate from the simple rational expectations models in order to do that, and we have adopted one particular way of doing that here.